Are we on? Hello, good evening. Thank you all for staying. Hope you enjoyed the movie. We're going to start off now with a panel discussion as promised in your tickets, which you all paid for very nicely. I'd like to welcome the panel who are here with us today. Starting on my left, as it happens, is Dr. Nat O'Connor, who is the director of TASC. Beside him, we have a real living, breathing economist. That's Mary Sherlock from SIPTU. Here we have a real living, breathing American, Margaret E Ward. She's also a financial journalist and she runs her own company called Clear Inc. And beside her is Colm O'Regan. He describes himself as a comedian and a best-selling author. Irish Mammy's website, apparently. He's also the chief executive of a small company that might one day become a massive company. You just never know, folks. I think we better start by asking each of our panelists to just react to the movie that they've seen. And I would have started with Margaret, because she's American and obviously to blame for everything you've just seen in that movie. But actually, I think I'll start with Nat, because he's the only one of us who has a beard. So, Dr. Nat O'Connor.
Thanks very much, Sean. Thanks indeed for everybody for being here. And I suppose on behalf of TASC, first of all, just to say we're very grateful to the Jameson Dublin International Film Festival and indeed to Cineworld for hosting us here this evening as part of the great programme of events that the Jameson Festival is putting on. As Prentice Rossa said at the outset, TASC is an independent progressive think tank. And I suppose what we're doing is we're looking around Ireland, we're looking around Europe, we're looking around the world, in this case to America, to see, well, are these ideas, is this analysis relevant to Ireland? And I think overwhelmingly we can say yes, it is. Ireland's economy is not the same as the United States. But if you look at that suspension bridge diagram, and you see it there in the leaflet which each of you has, that we can see a very similar pattern in Ireland from the work of Thomas Piketty, who will be coming to Ireland later this year. We have a similar growth in the top 1% incomes in Ireland. We've seen that high incomes in Ireland have grown over the last 3 decades, while average wages have stagnated. But at the same time, we have one of the highest rates of low pay in the European Union, according to Eurostat. And the Department of Finance tells us that 1.5 times the minimum wage, or rather there's a third of workers earn no more than 1.5 times the minimum wage, which keeps them underneath a living wage. So 1 in 3 workers in Ireland don't achieve a living wage through their work. So we have the kind of disparities in Ireland that we see in the States, not to the same extent, but of course we have some of the same negative cycles. We've seen the explosion in debt in Ireland in recent years. We've had the similar boom and bust in housing, the use of assets to prop up people's debt-fueled consumption, and of course the collapse of that. So I could say much more, but as opening words, very much what we've seen in the film is very much relevant to Ireland. And Ireland, like the United States, all of the European Union, is a consumption-led or wage-led economy. The whole planet is wage-led, and there is an opportunity to create an upward spiral, or the virtuous cycle that Reich describes, of a wage-led growth, allowing for greater public investment in targeted infrastructure, investing in people, as Rice talks about, which leads to the productivity, which in turn allows us to sustain higher wage levels, but also that higher consumption in the economy. So there's a lot of relevance to Ireland in what we've seen in the film. I'll stop there.
Right, Margaret, I'm afraid I've been rather unchivalrous there, beating up on you a lot already. But look, you've lived in America, you've lived in Ireland. Isn't that right? Are we seeing trends coming from America in terms of the income inequality in society?
Yes, I mean, I found that film interesting for many reasons. My parents are actually Irish, and they emigrated to the United States in the 1950s looking for work. My father worked in financial services. He actually worked for, you're really thinking about Lehman Brothers. I worked for Lehman Brothers as well. And I lived through a lot of that story in terms of the boom and the bust. But I also had to work 3 jobs to put myself through college, and I had to pay off a student loan for 10 years, and a lot of Americans do. And this great American dream of social mobility, anybody can make it if they work hard enough, is dead. Without a doubt, it is dead. And I think there are huge lessons in this film for Ireland. And I've been here for nearly 20 years now, working as a financial journalist and running my own business. And something that we see in the news recently is problems with housing. You know, huge numbers, a huge increase in homelessness, problems with affordable childcare, people, you know, government talking about reintroducing fees at third level, problems with access to healthcare, and increasingly, also something similar to the United States, which wasn't touched on, is the eternal internship culture, where our young people are just going from one internship to another with no hope, and they're being told, well, aren't you lucky that you have an apprenticeship like this? You know, and if you don't like it, emigrate. So I think that while in Ireland we like to think that, oh, we're so much better than the United States, we have so many more, you know, social nets underneath us, they're being eroded, and we're not doing anything about it, and I find that very, very disturbing.
Pretty disturbing, pretty depressing outlook as well. Colm, you're a comedian, so please say something funny about this. But social mobility, do you see that as a real problem for this country?
Yes, I do. First of all, I should apologise. As a comedian, we would think that we would be kind of left of centre and subversive, but generally we spend a lot of our time taking the piss out of the poor ourselves. You notice a lot of our output, so we could do better ourselves. I'd see Dublin as being quite an unequal city. I live in Inchicore, and you know, when you cycle along the canal, you go west along the canal, and everything is lovely and sweet, and you pass Harold's Cross Bridge, and it's like going from Las Vegas or from San Diego into Tijuana. You know, we have blocks of inequality next to each other, which it shouldn't be. You know, and as I say, so I live in Inchicore, and it's a wake-up call. I think that movie about how we take for granted the things that we have been won for us already, like the privileges we have that have been. You know, we may not be in unions, but unions have won a lot of those wages that we have now have been won for us. I also confess to slipping into right-wing mode. I sell tea towels, so I'm a CEO of a tea towel business with Irish mammy things written on them, so I don't know how far that's going to go.
It's a massive future.
I'm waiting to float it, we'll see what happens. But when there's the cult of the job creator and the entrepreneur, and we self-aggrandize, we think we're better than because we've started from nothing, but we forget what we've been granted. I sell them, I use the post office, I stand in line with people claiming the dole, and I look down at them, and I'm just ready to these people taking my taxes. I forget about my free university education. The website I use to sell them was built by my wife, who trained in Falls for free. So what we forget, you know, when we talk about inequality, is that people like me, I'm okay. I'm not poor, but I forget why it's not all due to me. It's due to things that were won for us already over the last few decades. And I think there's a sense of watching that movie about when you look at inequality increasing over time, that the generations who won greater equality for people down the line, the ones that came after them, thought that they got everything through their own efforts. And in fact, it's like when they talk about no such thing as a free market. A market is as free as people who run it decided to be. So I think, you know, we should check our privilege to use. It's kind of a buzzword now, but if things are going okay, it's not all down to you, and don't throw away the rights that have been won for you by other people.
Thanks, Colm. Murray, you work for a trade union, so you probably agree with Robert Reich that trade unions are quite useful. So we leave all that aside, but you look at the numbers all the time. Are you seeing actual hard evidence of the type of things that Reich has been pointing to, particularly over the last 30 years? I mean, it doesn't seem to most of us, I guess, that we've had this massive explosion in inequality here, or am I completely wrong?
Well, no, I suppose the first thing that really struck me from this film, and I suppose the important and often not a neglected aspect in the debate about income inequality, is that it's not just about workers. It's about the impact on the economy as a whole, the effect of the contracting, the effect on the economy of contracting national income. Because of course, if you've got an erosion of consumers' purchasing power, that in turn affects what goes into the domestic economy. It threatens the viability of many small, medium and large businesses, and of course it affects profits and those jobs that are employed. So there is that vicious circle, and I suppose as Nat talked about, you know, it's all about trying to create that virtuous circle. So here in Ireland, certainly we're in a less extreme position compared to the United States, and I suppose Margaret talked about the social, the safety net, I suppose, that we have built up here, particularly since the 70s. But of course, remember, prior to that, that, you know, a lot of those, and particularly to the younger members in the audience, we don't remember a time when a lot of the social welfare system did not exist, and of course has been under so much, I suppose, threat over the past number of years because of the financial and economic crisis in this country. So yes, over the past decade and a half in particular, we have seen a widening of income inequality, and while during the crisis that has been narrowed because of the working of the social welfare system in this country. But we are seeing, certainly, when you look at average incomes, we know that the average worker in this country, post-tax, their real income is about 8% less now compared to what it was in 2008. And I don't have the figures going back 10 years ago because there has been improvement certainly during the 2000s. But one of the big questions is, will we see an improvement back to where they were during the 2000s? Because, of course, in some sectors, there was very significant wage growth. So I suppose that's the first thing with regards to inequality. But the second thing that really struck me in this film is, Robert Reich talks about at the start about, you know, who do we blame for this? Is it government? Is it the bankers? Is it the employers? And I was very struck by that man, I don't know if you remember, in Calpine Energy, and he was talking about you know, that he didn't have much education himself, so he was a labourer. But of course, if you're, you know, if you have the brains, then of course, why don't you go? You know, you're entitled to earn as much money as you want. And of course, we see that in the film, that whole concept of equality of opportunity for all is totally taken apart. The American dream was not just built on equality of opportunity, it was built on institutions such as strong investment in education, such as a strong labour movement. And of course, we've seen the erosion of that, and people unable to afford the education system over the past decade in particular in the United States. And of course, it's becoming increasingly difficult in this country in terms of accessing education, albeit that we have protected a lot of, I suppose, what would be considered free education, notwithstanding the high registration fees and whatever else. So the big issue is, you know, who do we blame? More importantly, what do we do about it? And of course, the key message from the film is really that, you know, we need to all think, do we try and achieve change individually, or are we better off coming together? And yes, we can stay angry, we can blame the right, we can blame big business, or we can actually mobilise and come together. And it's not just as simple as casting your vote at election time for the party that you think that best represents you. Yes, that needs to be done, but there's a limit to what politics can achieve. It's about ourselves as well, joining trade unions or joining other groups and actually mobilising to try and bring about better living standards for ourselves in the workplace and in society in general.
Just on to come back there with one small bit of information from another think tank that will remain anonymous. The 8% fall in income has happened since 2008. Prior to that, since 2000, there was a 17% rise. So you knock 8% off of that, so it's 9% up since the year 2000. Very boring detail and all that. But right in that movie is having quite a cut at globalisation. And I think we've done rather well out of globalisation as a country, as an economy, haven't we? We've had a lot of inward investment from America. They've been capitalising. We sell them on our high-skilled workforce. So there must be something going right for us.
Well, absolutely. Globalisation has been very good to Ireland in terms of the number of multinationals that have located here. And certainly when you look at the extent to which we depend on exports as an economy, like as in Robert Reich talked about the American economy, 70% of the US economy depends on domestic consumption. In this country, it's about 50%, because about 25% of the Irish economy depends on net exports. So we're a small, open economy and highly dependent on net exports. And yes, globalisation has been good to us. But the really interesting thing for me was he didn't really talk about the tipping point. And he showed, yes, the Occupy Wall Street movement, and he showed plenty of other, the Tea Party movement. But he didn't talk about the tipping point. And one of the things I worry about is when we look at the price of consumer goods. So yes, the price of consumer goods has dramatically fallen over the past 20, 30 years. And that is because of globalisation. Of course, it's one of the things that has mitigated the stagnation in wages. But we know that particularly in the Far Eastern countries, which have been traditionally low cost and have permitted the Western economies to enjoy very cheap consumer goods, we know that costs are growing there, the prices are growing in those countries, and that ultimately is going to have a knock-on impact in terms of higher consumer prices in the West. And we're going to come to a point where, you know, the affordability of those cheap goods, and of course we know that the access to credit has been significantly limited since the start of the financial crisis, but we still have consumer goods that are relatively cheap. But when they're going to start to creep up, what is going to be the public and the social response to that? I think that's going to be a big key question with regards to globalisation and where it goes.
Ladies, we've a friend here with a microphone, and we are going to come to you for questions in a couple of moments. I'm just going to ask a couple of more questions out to the panel before we do that. And Nat, one of the things that struck me over the past couple of months is that a lot of rich people, seriously rich people, are starting to get worried about income inequality as an issue. I mean, it was one of the key topics at Davos this year, definitely a rich person's club. You have the likes of Soros getting involved into the debate, Warren Buffett talking about the tax bills that were quite outrageous. Today, Larry Summers writing in the Financial Times about how taxation system ought to be changed to deal with inequality. Why are these kind of people getting worried about it?
In short, it's a numbers game. And in the short term, if people are thinking, well, how is this going to affect me this quarter, this year? How is it going to affect my return to my shareholders, to my board? People think about the short term. So they think about getting a tax cut now to increase whatever their business is doing, increase the turnover, get a better return so people buy your stocks and shares. But people like Warren Buffett and George Soros are taking a longer term view. And what they've realized is exactly what Rice describes, that if you don't have a consumer base in your economy, then Americans aren't going to buy mattresses made in America, they're going to buy them made elsewhere. You're not going to have that consumer spending. And Reich's key argument is that even the wealthy would prosper, because rather than taking a bigger piece of a shrinking pie, they would have a smaller slice, but of a growing cake. And if you can do the longer term numbers, the economy is a complex system, but nonetheless, that's where the real win-win scenario is, that you have to have a growing economy, and you can only do that given that consumption is the biggest component of our economy, if you bring back money right across society, across the middle, down to people in lower incomes. Because that consumption, if it doesn't happen, is lost forever. People don't go back in time and say, well, I'm going to buy the 300 loaves of bread we couldn't have. People just do without. The consumption is lost. The potential in your economy is, your economy is traveling less than its full potential output if you don't use all the talent that's there. And indeed, if you don't invest in people and allow them to be as good as they can be in your economy. And we've seen the Nordic countries and others, Netherlands, Germany, where there's been investment in people, likewise in Japan and Korea, that they get the results.
Margaret, again, that same sort of theme. You've got all these rich guys starting to get worried about it. You've spoken already about the articulating the fears and concerns of the middle class in America. Do you think we're at a tipping point in American politics in particular, and a lot of their ideas do tend to filter out to the rest of the world?
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, again, there is something in Americans about a great belief in the American dream. It is something. It's not just this myth. It is something that has sustained us, and this, great belief that the WASP belief. You work hard and you will get whatever you want. Just put your head down and keep going. And people are very disillusioned now because they haven't seen that for themselves, and they certainly don't see it for their children. And I think that is, he did kind of touch on the polarization of the American political system as well. And I think that fracture is coming from the anger. And one thing in particular that I think I'm seeing more and more of, and especially I talk to a lot of people in their 20s about where they are in their life and where they're going. And I got a phone call from this girl that I mentor who had been laid off from one of the big tech companies. And she was so frustrated. And she said, I just put everything into it and I worked all these hours and I feel like I'm getting nowhere. And I thought, there are a lot of people who are feeling like that, and she's only in her 20s. But what seems to be happening is that the quality and security of employment has been greatly eroded. So you go in young, they work you to death for about 20 years, your health suffers, then they kind of realize, oh, they're too expensive, so you're laid off, and then they may or may not hire you back as a consultant without any benefits. So what is the knock-on cost for our society? in that. You know, you have people who are burned out, who are not protected in any way, their health suffers, they don't see their families. I mean, there's so many things about the fabric of society and the way that we relate to one another that comes in here. So it's not just age that is an issue, they're also cutting the benefits. And Seán, I don't know if you saw during the week, but there was an American CEO who came out and he said that he called together people in his company and he said, look, we have to cut your retirement benefits. You know, sorry about that, but it's because there have been a number of catastrophic, you know, births. Meaning there were these two children who were born with these terrible illnesses, you know, and he alleged that it cost the company millions.
It was AOL, wasn't it?
Was it AOL?
I think it was, yeah.
I think maybe it was AOL. And so basically the parents of this, one of the children came out and said, hang on a second here. Like, you're blaming, you know, our child's struggle for survival on the bottom line of this company. So now you're cutting everybody's retirement benefits? What kind of society allows that? You know, is that really what we want? That shareholders are the ones who dictate the way we live our lives?
There's a few pension schemes starting to get cut around here as well. But Colm, that's America. This is Ireland. We're more or less part of Europe. We're different, aren't we? We don't do all that kind of mad stuff.
I don't know. I think there's a tendency we because there's quite a strong influence of the American philosophy here because of all the multinationals, and it's good in many ways because there's a get up and go attitude and all of that. But we do worship that kind of almost masochistic attitude to work here, and there is respect for working long hours, and and it also feeds into our genetically inbuilt martyrdom complex, which we have for other reasons anyway. So we do worship America. If you think of the Irish attitude to who would they prefer to emulate, it's probably more so America rather than France. The French, they retire too early. They're sitting around their two insouciant. Look at the Americans; they're all, get up and go. So I think we can drift in that direction if we're not careful. And I say I don't. I suppose what I would add, again, it's a wake-up call to me because we think of ourselves as we're self-made, but we forget what has been created for us and what, the things that have been provided for us, particularly free education, which is now being eroded. Third level education, I would have got it anyway because I was a farmer's son and we get everything. But that's for different reasons. That's because we have the land. But it's far more expensive. Free education is far more expensive now, for example. It's, whatever registration fees or whatever. I think they're possibly nearly €1,000. I paid 2.5. I paid 200. And that's a big change without an in-step increase in wages over time. So that, we're heading that direction, I think.
Mary, you want to make something brief on that?
Just like, certainly as a country, we're not at all immune from, as in what you were talking about there about AOL, because most of you will remember the Irish ferries debacle. I think it was in 2005, 2006, the Turkish Gamma workers, and there's a whole host of other examples. And I suppose what shocks me day in, day out is that in my own union, in SIPTU, that in some ways there's many of us who kind of think, well, there's plenty of employment rights and people are decently treated. And we see with contract cleaners or security people, and they're actually in industries where some of the employers are actually really good employers. But we see in the hotels industry, the hospitality industry, some atrocious practices, people being paid half the minimum wage and the hours that are put in. And of course, you remember the man from Pakistan, the chef from Pakistan a number of years ago, and the length he had to go to try and redeem his wages, and of course was ultimately unsuccessful. So the thing is, these things are going on day in, day out in the Irish workplace. And while many of us might think that we're immune from some of the things that we've heard going on in the States, it is certainly not the case. And particularly for lower paid and for migrant workers, there is a real issue with regards to employee rights, workers' rights, and actually how we actually come together and defend those rights. And we all stand together, both medium, high and low paid workers together, because unless all three branches of workers come together, we won't get any change.